Day of Action for highered.org. And there will be over 195 in-person events and protests on campuses across the country. Before I introduce our speakers, let me make two housekeeping announcements. We will be recording the presentations, but the recording will be turned off during the Q&A. Second, put your questions in the chat at any time during the presentations, and I will then sort of bunch them and curate them when we get to the Q&A. Now, to our speakers. First will be Jenna Lloyd, who is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work examines the production and politics of health inequalities in the U.S., U.S. detention, asylum, and refugee policies, connections between abolition and migrant justice. Her new work focuses on immigration law as a structural determinant of health for migrants on a warming planet. She's the author of Health Rights Are Civil Rights, Peace and Justice Activism in Los Angeles, 1963 to 1978, and co-editor of Beyond Walls and Cages, Prisons, Borders, and Global Crisis, and co-author of Boats, Borders, and Bases, Race, the Cold War, and the Rise of Migration Detention in the US. The second speaker will be A. Naomi Paik. She is the author of Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, Understanding US Immigration for the 21st Century, and also of Rightlessness, Testimony and Redress in US Prison Camps Since World War II. Her next book-length project, Sanctuary for All, calls for the most capacious conception of sanctuary that brings together social and environmental justice. She's co-edited 4 special issues of Radical History Review, including one on radical histories of sanctuary. And she co-edits the Borderlands section of Public Books, as well as the Politics of Sanctuary blog of the Smithsonian Institution. Naomi is an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and a member of the Sanctuary Campus Network, of Sanctuary for All, UIC, of the Migration Scholars Collaborative, and finally a faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Okay, I will turn it over to you now, Jenna.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Kahi, and all of the organizers for this event. I'm working on sharing my slides, which are the slides Naomi and I are both using. Are those showing up for folks correctly? Yeah, thumbs up. Cool. Well, welcome everybody. I hope your day is going well. There are so many things planned for today. It's very exciting. So let's jump in. This is a webinar that the Sanctuary Campus Network, which Naomi and I are both part, has organized for you all today. Let me see about advancing my slides. What brought you here? Please add into the chat what brought you to this space. And Naomi will also be entering into the chat as you think about what brings you here, some of our community principles for this meeting and all of the other meetings that Sanctuary Campus Network organizes, which are first Fridays of every month. So what brought you here? So why Sanctuary Campus now? This will go through this outline in a second. But on many levels, the response to this seems kind of obvious because so many people are under attack by the state, corporate power, oligarchs, extra state actors. If people can lose their rights for writing op-eds, then we are in a different terrain. And this means that we actually share a dire need to protect and defend each other from our attacks on our very existence. And along the way, we need to build new relationships, learn new skills, figure out short-term tactics and long-term strategies to build power. So under conditions of rising authoritarianism, we need to draw on a wide array of tools and tactics, many of which are not in the wheelhouse of academics, which I assume many of us in the audience are. So a lot of us, myself and ourselves included, rely on certain strategies, like writing letters of protest with demands to our administrations, mobilizing and attending protests, as many of us are going to do today, and other ways of visibly expressing our dissent. These are good strategies. And also in this moment of heightened surveillance and fascist policing, they can expose people to increased risk of harm and stall out once the opposition has been expressed. So we want to think through how we can use these tools that we are familiar with, and also move to build power to protect each other now and towards decolonizing our university and creating a more democratic university as part of a broader democratic society. So this is a time, we think, to reorient to each other and to academics, our institutions, redefining who we are, what we do for the long haul. And we are thinking of this very much informed by abolitionist thought on the relationships between reforms and non-reformist reforms, what the sort of like guiding ideas of abolition are, and what we do in the current moment. So I'm gonna sort of go through and thinking about this current conjuncture, like what do we have to learn in brief? There are many more things to learn from the history of sanctuary within this continent, and thinking about like what that can tell us and also what's different about our current moment. And then Naomi is going to move into thinking about how it is that we can build power. So Naomi, if you can ping me if I'm like running too slow or something like that. Okay. All right. So 1980s sanctuary movements, which Naomi lovingly calls the OG sanctuary movements. So many of you are familiar with these movements. And I do think it's a time where I'm just giving a sort of like top level sort of overview. And I think this sets of movements bear more study as we're thinking about sanctuary in this moment. These are transnational movements. These were transnational movements. And I think that internationalism is something that we can be thinking about strongly today. So in the 80s, right, these were movements for democratic societies in El Salvador, Guatemala, and other countries in Central America, principally. They were organizing against the US backing of civil wars and despotism in Central America. And these movements, again, that were oftentimes first organized by, for instance, Salvadoran migrants and refugees, they were interested also then in providing concrete support for people who had to flee their countries and to try and transform the border regime. So there was always this sort of like internationalist perspective and ways of trying to transform power of the United States that was shaping countries elsewhere, and also transform the conditions of the United States government in preventing people from living their lives with safety. So some of the sort of ways in which this movement grows across North America including US, Mexico, Canada, but other countries also were quite opposed to the militarism taking place in Central America, were the assassinations of Archbishop Oscar Romero, and soon thereafter, 4 women who were, they often get referred to as church women, as who were American women who were doing work, living in El Salvador, and their murders, their assassinations caused a great deal of international outrage, including labor actions such as the ILWU blocking shipments of arms to El Salvador. And then many churches also got involved in trying to provide sanctuary again, as well as like lobbying the government, the US government, to stop its arms and other kinds of military support. So in this moment as well, a number of cities, like people started organizing around the principle of like, well, you know, what if sanctuary is broader than a church? And so asking for cities to like get involved in this type of thing. So again, super fast forwarding on a number of these issues. There's a lot more to say here. These like hundreds of thousands of people being involved in solidarity with one another also led to the creation of some new legal frameworks, such as the passage of the invention of TPS and temporary protected status in 1990, and the creation of NACARA in 1997, which created legal protections for certain groups of people. And so that, you know, led to some more sort of permanent or permanent-ish forms of legal protections that are one of the sort of outcomes of this moment of OG sanctuary. So this is a quotation by Jose Artiga, who is a San Francisco-based organizer, talking about how there were many different organizations who were involved in sanctuary. And I think one of the things that's very interesting about this is that is his view of having different ways for people to get involved in sanctuary organizing. So to quote him, people after a presentation or becoming aware of a situation would have a really bad feeling. And then you, as an organizer, would say, well, it's your tax dollars that are financing these human rights violations. And then the question they would ask is, what do I do? And here's where, with lots of creativity, we had a menu of things that people could do. They could join CISPAS, which still exists as an organization. They could get involved in sanctuary, support refugees. And so here, you know, Artiga is talking about creating solidarities, but also, you know, providing different ways in which people could express that solidarity in concrete ways of organizing. Okay, fast forward. Promise you is fast forward. So fast forward 2001 and the beginnings of the Global War on Terror, which is GWOT, and the expansion of migration, detention, and policing. So after 9/11, there were thousands of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian men who were detained on suspicion of terrorism. And the INSEERS program itself required registration of 16 to 45-year-old men from 25 Arab, Muslim, and South Asian countries. So this was of those registrants. You know, several thousand were also placed into deportation proceedings after having provided that information to the government. And so the image on the right, the map on the right, shows one of the maps from the NYPD's demographics unit, which was essentially spying on Arab and Muslim communities in New York City, as just the sort of like local version of what's happening nationally. So following 2001 as well, the Department of Homeland Security itself is created. And this results in the reorganization of INS into ICE and Customs or Border Patrol into Customs and Border Protection. And there's also this expansion of the capabilities of the detention and deportation or expulsion apparatus. Skip forward another few years, and this sort of wave of repression in the name of terrorism also gets sort of amplified in terms of criminalization of existing immigrants, or the desire to do so. So the Sensenbrenner bill, Sensenbrenner comes from the state I live in, Wisconsin, passed in the US House. And in response to that, in 2025, in response to that, there were massive organizing and protests on May Day of 2006 and days after. The images we see here are of May Day event, I believe in Chicago, or Naomi, you can correct me if maybe that's New York. And then the image on the right shows the scale of the march for that day in Los Angeles, which is where I was at this time. And I can attest, it was the most massive march that I had ever seen. Even surpassing that of the anti-war, anti-Iraq war marches of just a couple of years prior. So this mass sort of turnout into the streets and work stoppage, which again in Los Angeles was quite palpable, was really important in trying to challenge this bill, which would have criminalized presence of people who didn't have legal status in the United States, increased border fortification, deputized police, et cetera, et cetera. And so this was called this enforcement only type of bill. It had no provisions for actually allowing people in the US, what at the time was called some sort of like offering the same sort of avenues to regularize as Reagan had signed into office. So in response to this, sort of the government sort of counterattacked and carried on a series of workplace raids. One of the, and this becomes the sort of origins of what people at the time called the New Sanctuary Movement. So Elvira Arellano is one of the people who is associated with the sort of origins of this 2006 era movement. She herself was working at O'Hare Airport, was arrested in a raid, went into sanctuary at a church in Chicago, and then subsequently this became a tactic that others were using again elsewhere in the country. And churches once again became interested in how it is that they could provide material support for people. And in this moment, very much talking about challenging raids and the sorts of status that would make people unlawful. According to the state, people can't be unlawful. Okay, so some of the critical lessons of this are that movement building and leadership by immigrants and has been transnational and in solidarity with other groups of people as well. I think there's the importance of multiple on-ramps to participation as the quotation that I gave you from the organizer in San Francisco. They also thought really carefully about how to navigate being public about certain kinds of their work and moments when that publicity wouldn't necessarily serve the safety and well-being of the people whom they are trying to support. And that's something we'll turn to later. However, at the time, this was debated and it's continued to be debated. In both moments of the OG sanctuary and the new sanctuary movements, there has been a sort of prioritization of terms of innocence, such as talking about refugees as to be prioritized versus immigrants, which just reproduces the state's terms of themselves, and had also sort of fostered the idea of refugees as those to be saved. So fostering ideas of white saviorism, even though, of course, it was immigrants themselves and refugees themselves who were often leading this movement. And then later on, there also were terms of like, if in protecting the idea of particular groups of people, such as moms and their kids, who is being sort of implicitly, like whose families are implicitly being left out of the scenario or sort of framed out of the terms of deservingness. So this is something that this debates are ones that we also inherit at this moment. So the slide's a little bit wonky, but what it's trying to do is think about this current conjuncture that we're living in right now in terms of some continuities between the 80s and 2000s and our current moment. So some of the continuities certainly would be that the US has continued to align with authoritarian regimes, right? So we can think of certainly, we can think of Bukele, we can think of Orban, we can think of Netanyahu, we can think of Putin, we can think of Modi, right? So those alignments with authoritarian regimes have continued. There have also been repression of solidarity activism from across all of these moments of time. And there have also across these moments been linkages among the geopolitical or foreign policy stances that the US government have been taking, and invocations of nationalism and anti-immigration, right? So those are some continuities that we see. And at the same time, in our current moment, what we see is, a much more digitized surveillance system where databases are, and the interconnections across databases are becoming incredibly important, emerging, like in terms of how it is that the state is able to locate people. So I think that's something we're going to need to think about a lot more closely in terms of how we can protect people when so much data can be hoovered up by the state in terms of locating other folks. We also, though, have in 2020, both the COVID pandemic, as we all know, and the mass uprisings against anti-Black racism. And what this moment did, of course, COVID was deeply painful and so many people lost loved ones. It also was a moment that people really came together as well and tried to protect one another. And the kinds of tools that people developed and the kinds of relationships and skills that people developed in the course of doing that and in the course of protesting against police violence are, very much broadened the kinds of things that we can do now. And I think inform how we within Sanctuary Campus Network have been thinking about organizing. There is also the sense that while there has been repression of solidarity activism, that at this moment, the Democratic Party is more or less, part of that repression of solidarity activism. So it doesn't seem that there's a sort of institutional bulwark against repression within the mainstream political system that we have. And then finally, we see a tightening convergence among terrorism legislation, criminal like criminalization and criminal legislation, as well as migration systems themselves. So those are some of the sort of like emergent issues that we're seeing now that set the terrain that's slightly different than the 1980s, where detention was just being as a permanent sort of feature, didn't really exist in 1980. It does in a big way now. So what does that tell us? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Naomi, and you can tell me when to advance slides.
Okay, thanks so much, Jenna. Thank you so much for that really powerful and very succinct lesson from history, many lessons from history from the sanctuary movements in the United States. So I'm going to move on to discussing sanctuary organizing on our campuses, both as a framework for thinking about organizing and organizing campaigns and actions and so on, but also as offering tools for building power over the long haul. Okay, so what are we building power for? I think for me, and I think for our network, it is not solely for administrators to declare our campuses as sanctuaries. That is not the end goal, right? It's not that making demands on administration is unimportant. I still think it is an important part of the work, but everything that's happened since Trump 1.0 and before shows the limits of that strategy. It's kind of like calling into the wind, right? Nothing happens. So what we're really interested in is using the framework of sanctuary campuses as a means of building power among faculty, students, workers, and community members, regardless of whatever university bureaucrats do. We know we can't count on them, so maybe let's stop pretending that they care about us. Okay. So what we're really building towards, and this is in our Why Sanctuary Campuses Now document, which I'm just putting in the chat right now. What we're ultimately building towards is a decolonized democratic university as a space of experimentation for democratic thinking, democratic activity, where we can envision and build the world that we want. Right. So we know, I know you already know this, but the university has been a prime target in the efforts to destroy democracy, precisely because it has historically served as a space of democratic experimentation that has given birth to new organizations, new ideas, social formations. But as we all know, over the past decades, the university has become a site as a site of democratic engagement has been continually undermined in large part by public divestment and political economic issues, which compel universities to bend the knee to any source of funding, including institutions that profit off of war, policing, detention, colonial land grabs, and planetary plunder. So universities increasingly rely on finance capital, both institutional finance and real estate investments that have basically turned our universities into hedge fund managers and landlords that offer courses for legitimacy, as well as, and Jenna really pointed this out, as well as the education finance industry that burdens our students with irrecoverable debts and makes higher education an impossible dream and foments resentment against higher education as some kind of elitist endeavor rather than as a social good and a bedrock for building a democratic populace. So as Jenna has stated in a different meeting, we are not fighting for liberal institutions, right? Or some fictive fantasy past, but we are fighting against forces like racism, transmisogyny, and authoritarian nationalism that are tearing us apart from the inside out. So that's what our ultimate big goal is with all of this organizing. We want to build power for a democratic university as a space of experimentation, right? Where we get to envision and build the world that we want. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to drop our values in here. These are the values that, again, are in the Why Sanctuary Campus Now document that I shared above. But these are some of our core commitments of the Sanctuary Campus Network. So first is Sanctuary for All. As Jenna's brief history showed us, the good immigrant versus bad immigrant framing and the logic of innocence have not only been ineffective at protecting people from state violence, but they have also divided our movements, pitting targeted people against each other instead of against our real enemies, our real agents of oppression. So if that was not entirely clear before, it should be very, very obvious by now that there is no such thing as a good, bad immigrant distinction, right? All immigrants are bad immigrants at this point. So, you know, our students and colleagues who are being kidnapped or having their green cards or their visas revoked and being subjected to detention and deportation many of these are the quintessential good immigrants. Right. So it started out with the targeting of Mahmoud Khalil, Badr Khansuri, Rumeysa Ozturk, Yunso Chung, and Mamadou Tal for their pro-Palestine activism, which means that sanctuary, pro-Palestine, and anti-repression work have merged. Right. They are literally the same struggle in this historical moment, regardless of your perspective on Palestine. Okay, so engaging in a progressive except for Palestine framework to our organizing basically assures a path to our mutual destruction. So maybe let's not do that. Okay. Another example is the Laken Riley Act basically makes any non-citizen merely accused of shoplifting deportable. So we just need to abandon any kind of logic of innocence. Okay. The growth in detentions, in ICE detentions, is driven by migrants with no criminal history, including many of those sent to Guantanamo, as well as the Venezuelans trapped in the hellhole of CICOT in El Salvador. And, you know, the Trump administration has said openly that it is looking for ways to kidnap and render citizens to this really horrific supermax camp, right? So no one really is safe. So the only way you can assure your own safety is by assuring the safety of those around us. Okay, we cannot distinguish between the deserving and undeserving or condemn some to save others if we are going to survive this. And so this requires acting in solidarity without exception. Okay, so that's Sanctuary for All. Sanctuary for All necessarily leads to an abolitionist approach to sanctuary. So instead of looking for more precise and legitimate targets of state violence, like the Palestinian, the terrorist, the actual gang member, or the criminal alien, we need to instead organize to undo the conditions that enable authoritarian repression in the first place. So as Detention Watch Network organizer Silky Shaw has argued, fascism is executed through policing and criminalization, which means we have to undermine and dismantle criminalization that legitimizes policing, as well as prisons, camps, surveillance, and military violence. And as the examples that Jenna has already laid out show, while our on the ground organizing is local by necessity, because those are the people that we have the most kind of capacity to mobilize, to protect, et cetera. It's also crucial to embed our struggles in an internationalist framework so that we can connect defense, community defense, to those webs of oppressive power that stretch across wide expanses of space, from Mexico to Palestine, from Venezuela to El Salvador, and from China to Louisiana. And I think this gets to Ruthie Gilmore's statement that abolition has to be red, green, and international. Okay, so can we go forward one more slide? Okay, so now we're below those little arrows. Oh, back one more. Yeah, right here. So below those little arrows. Okay, so in terms of like actually doing the work, how do our core commitments translate into the actual activity? So one is that, and this can be really hard, okay? But centering humanity in all of the work, in everything you do, and centering the humanity even of the people you despise. So hi admin, I hate you, but I have to recognize that you are also human and doing human things, right? So organizing is all about relationships, and relationships are really hard because people are really hard and complicated. So just keeping that top of mind and remembering to, again, to aim your anger upwards at our actual enemies who are trying to kill us, and not horizontally against people who are trying their best. And that, again, that can be really hard because we're not going to agree. There's going to be lots of disagreements, and sometimes those can be really intense. But remember, always come back to center my own humanity, center the other people's humanity. Okay. Another kind of core principle is collaboration. So Miriam Kaba has said many wise things, but one thing that she said recently is that nobody knows what to do right now because there's not one thing for us to do, right? We're in uncharted terrain, which means none of us have a map or a clear way forward, and we all have to figure it out on the fly with each other. So this is kind of a truism, but it shows up a lot in the work, so that none of us knows everything, but together we know a lot. If we don't know, we know how to research and figure things out, or to think through hard problems collectively. And we can do more than we think we're capable of, right? So instead of trying to find that one thing that doesn't exist that we should all be doing, we should be trying all the things all the time. So we have to be willing to try and to fail and to learn from failures and mistakes and to try again. So this is the ethos of this thing called 1 million experiments. Hold on, let me put this in the chat. So it's a podcast, a website, and also now a documentary. I highly recommend hosting a documentary screening with the filmmakers. But this is the ethos of 1 million experiment, that you try things. If you fail, you learn from failure and you try again, right? Just showing up and following through on the work is doing more than half of the work, right? So if you say you're going to send the email, then go ahead and send the email. That's a lot. That lifts a lot of the labor from other folks. And I think the main thing is that we can't use not knowing what to do as an excuse to do nothing, right? We're in this moment where we need all hands on deck, and everyone really does have something to contribute, even if you feel like I have no real skills, I'm just a researcher, etc. You actually do have really powerful skills that when you collectivize it can actually move things in a certain direction. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about practical things we can do to jump into the work. Okay, so first, it's okay to feel like you don't know what you're doing. The structure of academic labor has trained us to do a lot of background work before we even have permission to jump in. So think about like you have to do 2 years of coursework, then you have qualifying exams, then you have prospective defense, and then you can like go do your research. We don't need to do that in organizing work. In organizing work, we can be thoughtful and draw on the expertise that we have ourselves, but also on the folks around us. So I am not an expert on Palestine, but I lean a lot on my colleagues to learn more, to tell me what to read, etc. So that could be the case for immigration or for anti-fascist work, etc. So we can do that kind of thoughtful engagement, political education, and move forward with action simultaneously. So again, the main takeaway is do not let not knowing what to do serve as an excuse for doing nothing. A second thing, it's like you can start small. The Sanctuary Campus Network that Jenna and I and several people on the call are involved with, it started off with very small informal meetings of concerned people who reached out to each other because we all knew what was coming. So it really started with just a couple of people having conversations. Um, Another kind of principle is that know in advance that you are going to disagree with folks in your network or across the coalitions of organizations that you're trying to build power with. So this is why it's really important to establish shared principles and values to orient your work earlier on, right? So it's kind of like your ground floor and knowing where you fundamentally agree and you know what fundamentally guides your work together, even when you have disagreements over, for example, strategy or tactics. It's always good to start with what you know, what we know how to do, and also to push ourselves to move beyond it. So as academics, we are really good at making strong, compelling arguments. And things like letters of outrage and dissent and teach-ins are kind of like our bread and butter actions that a lot of us know how to do very well. And we can adapt our regular academic skills into those kinds of actions. And these are really good starting places. So I'm sure you guys have all seen the proliferation of petitions, letters, open letters, things like this, right? And those are good starting places, but we also want to ask, what else can we do with this letter? How can we use this letter or teach-in or whatever, not as an end in and of itself, because again, we know the administration doesn't give a shit about us. So, you know, we can spend time doing that, but what else can we do with this letter, right? How can we use it as an organizing tool to build more power? And remember, power building is one goal of anything that we do. So identify who else is interested in what we're doing in terms of that power building, right? So can you take your letter or your action and take it to all the different kind of interest groups that might have aligned politics with you? Who else can we collaborate with? So student groups really have superpowers. They can really work so fast, so much faster than we can. They have a real nimbleness. We have unions among faculty, among grad students, among our workers. We have community organizations, faculty organizations, even official units on campus, like cultural centers or resource centers or ethnic studies departments could also be part of your partners. The main point is you want to build power in part by looking what else is happening on the ground on your campus and figuring out how to plug in and build strong relationships with those things that are already moving. Okie dokie. Can we move on one more? Okay. So I'm just putting some resources into this chat. So some more practical strategies, bringing people into the work. You want to create a welcoming, warm energy that invites folks into the space and into the discussion. So one of the goals of having meetings and things like this is to create a vibe where people want to take part in that vibe. And try to make the work enjoyable in some ways. A lot of it is very tedious administrative work, but try to make it more fun as much as you can. We always bring food to our meetings, and things like this. Um, you want to show that everyone's presence really matters, that everyone's voice contributes to the discussion. So when someone raises a point that you didn't think of, you should say that. I didn't think of that. Thanks so much for raising that point. You want to offer many gentle on-ramps for folks to get involved in the same way that the OG Sanctuary movement kind of had a menu. You want to think about what are the gentle on-ramps. And make sure that no one ever works alone. So if one of the tasks is to put together an agenda, then have a new person come in and work with them on the agenda. Can you bring a snack to the next meeting? Can you make a flyer on Canva? Can you help with outreach by reaching out to the groups that you already know? One of the things we do at UIC is that we keep an outreach doc, which is just a chart with like the name of the organization, the person who's gonna reach out to them, and then like the response that they got from the outreach. We also prepare outreach language for folks to kind of facilitate that outreach to those organizations. Can you help write a letter? This is where, younger academics can kind of jump in, but again, never doing it alone. So the goal is to help folks feel like this is their work, like they feel like they are contributing meaningfully to a bigger project that none of us could do alone. So it's really important to show how other people's even small actions help us build power. We want to pull all levers of power and think about who is good at pulling which lever. So some people are really good at communicating with upper admin or already have direct ties to them. Some of us are better at public speaking or writing or event planning. So through like finding these different strengths and weaknesses, you want to do skills assessment and also skill share along the way so that people who aren't as good as public speaking learn that skill along the way. Okay, I think I have a slide that just talks through specifics at UIC just to give you like a really specific example, but I also noticed that we only have 15 minutes left. So I'm good with whatever folks want to do. If you want to hear a specific example, I can go through it, but if we want to go straight into Q&A, I'm also good with that.
Naomi, there are only a few questions in the Q&A at this point, and I think it might be useful if you gave a very concrete example of, what you had done at UIC.
Okay, could you advance the slide, please? Also, by the way, I didn't have very good images, so I just cribbed from Ruth Wilson Gilmore Girls, which you haven't seen it. You should definitely go check it out on Instagram or Blue Sky or whatever. Okay, so let me just talk to you about some stuff, how UIC Sanctuary for All started. It started with 3 people having lunch. That's literally how it started. It started super duper small. We're like me, another colleague, and then like 2 other colleagues, one who works in the cultural centers, and then one who's also a faculty member. We were all really worried, so let's have lunch. At that lunch, we planned a teach-in on Project 2025 to happen right after the election. And again, the event itself was only part of the point. The real goal was to get folks into a room to start building community. So we wanted to help us find the people who are looking for something to jump into or to just be with others and be with like-minded folks, even just to freak out together. During that teach-in, we had folks talk to each other about their concerns and what they wanted from the university. And we also asked folks to sign in so that we had a way to stay in touch and bring them into the work if they so wanted. From that early teach-in on Project 2025, we organized a Know Your Rights teach-in for the day after the election, which was also the first day of the semester for us. We actually maxed out the webinar room at more than 300 people kind of cycled through. At that meeting, we distributed privacy door signs that people could put on their offices and classrooms. And then from there, again, we had sign-in sheets and things like this. And we started having consistent meetings to figure out our power mapping, our primary concerns and demands to the university, and then also figuring out who our potential collaborators could be, like the unions, which student orgs, which community orgs, and so on. What are some other ways that we can be engaged with community work like rapid response teams? How can we bring what we learned from there back to campus, etc.? We did write a demand letter, but again, it's not, I don't expect them to respond to any of the demands. And in fact, we met with them and got a big nothing. So, which is expected. But again, the point of the demand letter was a way to forge stronger connections with our collaborators who are really crucial to refining our demands. So for example, the union pointed out that gender neutral bathrooms are actually a bargaining issue. And so we took that out of the letter because they were like, we will be covering that, and it's actually a union issue. Our disability justice folks added things that we just didn't have our eyes on, like new policy changes that were going to affect them, and asking for protections around that. We also had people from public health, which now is you have to swipe in just to get into the building, that raised questions around our demands for more private spaces. So figuring out the balance that we are still a public university, we want to be as open as possible to the community, and also we want to have clarity on what counts as a private space in case something like ICE shows up. I'll also say that today, the National Day of Action has really been crucial to helping us build relationships and strengthen the relationships that our group has with FSJP, student organizations, community organizations, and especially our unions. Like we have been, just to pull this off, we've had to have so many, I'm on so many fucking Signal threads. Like there's just so much communication. But now I know, you know, the head of the unions like pretty well, and I know some more of the GEO organizers really well. This is all really super beneficial for all of our work. And so we can take those relationships that we're building today that have been built just to get ready for today and mobilize that for things like May Day, and then move that into the summer and into the coming years. That is ultimately the goal of some of this power building. So thinking about these campaigns or actions as little stepping stones towards that bigger goal of building power. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I've been talking so long.
Okay. Thank you both very much for such informative, interesting, important presentations, but also ones that make it clear how much work we have to do. Let me take the two questions that have come in